Everyone knew the Soviet Union built locomotives, massive, powerful machines that dominated the Eastern Bloc for decades. But almost nobody realizes that in 1965, a Polish engineering team shattered every assumption Moscow had about diesel locomotive design, and the Soviets spent the next 15 years trying to catch up to what Warsaw had quietly achieved. The story begins not in triumph, but in frustration. By the early 1960s, Poland's railway network was suffocating under outdated steam power, while the Soviet Union mandated standardized diesel designs across all satellite states. The Soviets shipped their M62 diesel locomotive to Poland in 1964, a 2,000-horsepower workhorse meant to modernize Polish railways. Soviet engineers were confident. The M62 represented their best thinking, refined over years of development, tested across thousands of kilometers of Soviet track. Polish engineers at the Fablock works in Krzanów examined the Soviet machine with growing disbelief. The M62 was heavy, inefficient, and built with an almost deliberate disregard for fuel economy. It consumed diesel at rates that would cripple Poland's already strained economy. Worse, its cocoa wheel arrangement and rigid frame made it brutal on track, causing excessive wear that would cost millions in maintenance. The Soviets had optimized for raw power and political symbolism, not operational efficiency. Poland couldn't afford to run the M62 at scale, but they also couldn't afford to openly reject Soviet engineering without political consequences. So the Polish state railways and Fablock engineers made a calculated decision. They would build their own diesel locomotive, ostensibly to complement the Soviet design, but in reality to replace it entirely. The project received quiet approval in 1965. The locomotive would be designated ST-44. The design team, led by engineers who had survived decades of political upheaval, approached the problem with surgical precision. They studied the M62's failures and designed the ST-44 as its opposite. Where the Soviets used a 14-cylinder two-stroke engine that guzzled fuel, the Polish team specified a Sulzer 12 LDA 2.8 12-cylinder four-stroke diesel engine, producing 2,000 horsepower at significantly better fuel efficiency. The Sulzer engine, licensed from Switzerland, was lighter, more reliable, and crucially, easier to maintain with Poland's existing technical infrastructure. The wheel arrangement told the real story. Instead of the M62's COCO configuration, the ST-44 used a CC arrangement with individual axle drive. This wasn't just technical preference. The Polish design distributed weight more evenly across the track, reducing wear by nearly 30% compared to the Soviet machine. Track maintenance costs, an enormous burden for Polish railways, would drop dramatically. Soviet engineers had never prioritized this because the USSR had vast resources for track replacement. Poland did not. Then came the transmission. The M62 used a direct electric transmission that was robust but crude, wasting energy at every conversion. The ST-44 employed a DC generator and traction motors with sophisticated control systems that allowed for smooth power delivery and regenerative braking. Polish crews could recover energy on descents, feeding it back into the electrical system. Our Soviet locomotives simply burned fuel going downhill, transforming gravity into heat and noise. The first ST-44 prototype rolled out of Fablock in 1966, just 2 years after the M62 arrived. It was smaller, lighter, and looked almost delicate compared to the Soviet behemoth. Soviet advisors in Poland were skeptical. How could this machine, built by a satellite state, possibly match Soviet engineering? The answer came in the trials. Polish state railways ran both locomotives on identical routes across southern Poland's demanding terrain, steep grades and tight curves that punished any design weakness. The ST-44 consumed 22% less fuel than the M62 while delivering identical tractive effort. It accelerated faster, handled curves with less wheel slip, and placed dramatically less stress on the track structure. Maintenance intervals were longer, and component replacement was simpler because the Sulzer engine used widely available parts, not Soviet-specific components that required waiting weeks for shipments from Moscow. But the real embarrassment came in reliability data. After the first year of operation, ST-44 locomotives averaged 94% availability. The M62 barely managed 78%. Polish workshops could repair an ST-44 in days. Soviet M62s often sat for weeks waiting for specialized parts or technicians trained on Soviet-specific systems. The productivity gap was impossible to ignore. Every ST-44 in service effectively replaced 1.2 M62 locomotives in operational capacity. Word spread quietly through Eastern Bloc railway circles. East German engineers visited Krasnov to study the ST-44. Hungarian railway officials requested technical specifications. Even Soviet railway managers, facing their own efficiency crises, began asking uncomfortable questions about why a satellite state had produced a superior design using largely non-Soviet components. The political implications were delicate. The ST-44 wasn't just better engineering, it was evidence that Soviet standardization policy, imposed across the Eastern Bloc for ideological and political control, was actively harming industrial efficiency. Poland had broken the unwritten rule. You could modify Soviet designs, but you weren't supposed to surpass them. Moscow's response was telling. Rather than celebrate Polish innovation, Soviet engineers began a rushed redesign program for the M62. Between 1968 and 1973, they introduced multiple modifications, improving fuel efficiency, upgrading transmission systems, and revising the wheel arrangement. Each change brought the M62 closer to ST-44 specifications. Soviet technical journals published papers on optimal diesel locomotive design that read like detailed descriptions of the ST-44's features, without ever mentioning the Polish machine by name. Poland, meanwhile, scaled up production. Between 1966 and 1988, Fablock produced 1,191 ST-44 locomotives. They became the backbone of Polish heavy freight operations, hauling coal, steel, and industrial goods across the nation's rail network. Crews loved them. Compared to the M62, the ST-44 cab was quieter, better ventilated, and featured superior visibility. The engine's four-stroke cycle produced less vibration, reducing operator fatigue on long shifts. Small details, but they added up to a machine that workers trusted. The ST-44 even found export success. Czechoslovakia purchased a modified version. Morocco ordered locomotives based on the ST-44 platform for its phosphate railways. A Polish design, initially created to solve a domestic crisis, had become an international product, while the vaunted Soviet M62 remained mostly confined to Soviet-aligned nations and required continuous subsidies to remain competitive. The technical community understood what had happened, even if political rhetoric obscured it. The ST-44 represented a different engineering philosophy. Soviet designers prioritized standardization, mass production, and political reliability over operational efficiency. They built locomotives that could be manufactured anywhere in the USSR with whatever resources were locally available, even if that meant accepting lower performance. Polish engineers, constrained by limited resources and economic reality, had no choice but to optimize ruthlessly. Every kilogram of weight mattered. Every liter of fuel counted. Every hour of downtime was a direct hit to Poland's struggling economy. The ST-44's fuel efficiency advantage alone saved Polish railways millions of dollars over 2 decades. But the deeper victory was psychological. Polish engineers had proven that satellite states could innovate, that Soviet technical dominance was not inevitable, and that smaller nations could compete on merit when given the freedom to think independently. By the 1980s, even Soviet railway journals quietly acknowledged that the M62 had been surpassed by later designs, including the Polish ST-44. It was the closest Moscow came to admitting what everyone in the industry already knew. The embarrassment wasn't just that Poland had built a better locomotive, it was that they had done it faster, cheaper, and with borrowed Swiss technology, while the Soviet Union, with all its resources and technical institutes, had fumbled a straightforward diesel locomotive design. The ST-44 continued operating into the 21st century. Many were retired as Poland modernized its railways after joining the European Union, but dozens remained in service through the 2000s, hauling freight on secondary lines. Some were exported to private operators in other nations. A machine designed in the shadow of Soviet control had outlasted the Soviet Union itself. The legacy is complicated. The ST-44 didn't change history. It didn't win wars or reshape industries. But it quietly demonstrated that engineering excellence doesn't require superpower resources, just clear thinking and the courage to reject imposed mediocrity. Polish engineers in 1965 faced a choice: accept what Moscow provided or risk building something better. They chose the harder path, and for 15 years, every time an ST-44 pulled a trainload of coal past a struggling M62 sitting in a repair yard waiting for Soviet parts, the message was clear. Sometimes the best answer to authority is simply to build something that works better.